Random number generation is gaming's eternal demon, a necessary evil that underlies practically every game in one way or another. It is a hotly debated topic, mostly in the negative sense. You hear it often. RNG screwed, or damn the RNG. But those games that have no random element whatsoever are often solved quickly, either with a script or general approach that always wins. This even applies in a limited sense to PvP games. Simple ones like Tic Tac Toe have strategies that can either guarantee a win or a draw, and all possible strategies are known. When all possibilities are known and can be accounted for, this is called perfect information. There is a limit to what we as humans can solve, though. More complex games like chess or Go have too many variables, a far too large possibility space to be solvable in a short enough time to actually play the game. But they do seem to be solvable. Virtual games tend to have much smaller possibility space, often because these games tend to focus on delivering a specific experience, which then limits the possible solutions available to the players. Often games introduce overt randomness to give the impression of depth within the game systems, but without any randomness at all, games simply wouldn't be interesting to play. In order for a game to be engaging, we need to be challenged. Going through the motions of a game we know the outcome to will leave us bored quickly. One option to try and engage players is having a skill challenge. Most PvP games naturally have these in the behavior of other players and the inherent mechanics within, but even something as simple as shooting usually has some inherent randomness. Whether it be the spray patterns or some other mechanic embedded in the game like damage ranges, when it comes to competitive games, the randomness can be too obvious and players tend to vocalize their dislike for it. But sometimes randomness adds variety. But let's look at this randomness in some popular games. What makes it work, what doesn't, and why it's important to have random elements. To illustrate one end of the extreme, I can think of no game more infamous for its RNG than XCOM, a tactical turn-based game where you need to lead Earth's finest in the first and last line of defense against alien invaders. In XCOM, almost everything has an underlying layer of randomness. Taking a shot at an enemy will have a chance to miss, even if the barrel of your soldier's gun is pressed right against the alien's temple. And that's XCOM, baby. If you do manage to hit, the damage is random within a range. You might crit, or not. Throwing a grenade or using other explosives can have damage fall off, or another damage range, and so on. But the randomness in XCOM doesn't include only offensive actions. However, it is important to note that defensive abilities like healing or cover mechanics provide a consistent bonus here, which very rarely, if ever, is randomized, and therefore it feels reliable. Pushing forward in XCOM feels like a risk, one you cannot avoid, but it's tense and anxiety-inducing, whereas laying down defensive smokes or taking full cover offers a reprieve. With this in mind, even just moving might reveal enemies that were hidden to you before, and thus making the fight much more difficult as a random consequence for an action you had to take without perfect information available to you. A lot of players also play with an option enabled, which randomizes soldier stats within a range, so each soldier will be better or worse at certain tasks, such as aiming, mobility, or taking a hit entirely based on chance. And yet it is a beloved game, and in my opinion, XCOM Enemy Within, with the Long War mod specifically, is the greatest game ever made. How can I say that when the game is fraught with randomness? Well, that's because XCOM at its core is about being faced with overwhelming odds, bad options, difficult decisions, and molding that situation into a victory. To have plans and backups worked out ahead of time while also minimizing unnecessary risks so that when RNGesus does screw you, and he will screw you, you still have options and ways to react. Essentially, it is a game not about high-rolling or chasing the perfect outcome, but about stacking the deck so that when you do roll badly, you don't lose all your chips, minimizing losses to give ground in a losing battle to win the war, but I think you get the idea. A game in a similar vein, and also one I truly love, is Darkest Dungeon. Again, this game is about making the best of a bad situation, where XCOM highlights the individuality of each soldier. Darkest Dungeon sees the characters as nothing but fodder to the flame. At first glance, you're faced with the same kind of randomness, hit chances, damage ranges, and so on. The first difference comes in that defensive options are just as random as offense in this game. A heal is not necessarily guaranteed, and when your hero's mind cracks, they can flat out refuse the help of their companions. The game's hopeless tone lends itself to the sometimes unwinnable situations, and yet Darkest Dungeon manages to be hopeful, despite the hopelessness it presents, because losing is ingrained within the mechanics. Darkest Dungeon pushes the idea of abandoning the chase for a high roll to the extreme, where XCOM incentivizes hedging your bets and making plans within plans to be efficient. preserve your troops and play the long game, Darkest Dungeon instead all but forces you to throw your heroes to the slaughter, so you can gather just a few more trinkets or resources. Of course, you are rewarded for playing well and trying to preserve your characters, but it's very clear that this is not a priority from a systems perspective. On that note, all of the loot in Darkest Dungeon is randomly generated, often from a broad, predetermined pool. This means that the game has a pseudo-roguelite feeling to it. When rewards are somewhat randomized, it will create surpluses and shortages of certain resources. And how you deal with that is just another layer to the engagement that Darkest Dungeon offers. Of course, I have not covered all of the random elements in these games, nor can I cover all elements from any of the games in this video. But let's have a look at games with as little randomness in them as possible, and why some randomness still exists even there. Nice. The first type of game to look at is, of course, highly competitive PvP games. It's generally seen that having as little randomness in PvP as possible is essential. When systems in competitive games are too random, it actually reduces engagement because it can feel like you win or lose based on a coin toss, and there is little which allows a player's skill to shine through. A game like Counter-Strike has virtually no random elements. The damage each hit does, how the bullet spray works, how far and what angle grenades are thrown at, etc. It's all predetermined, and differences are purely down to the execution of the players. However, I want to say that even a game like Counter-Strike, where all the systems are laid out specifically, still falls into having RNG. It's just not immediately obvious at first glance. This RNG comes in the choices made by the players on the opposing team. Yes, of course I understand that this is not actually an RNG system. It's not a number generator making the decisions, but the game can stay engaging because you have to account for the decisions your opponents make in real time and deal with the consequences thereof. Effectively, random elements seem to provide the engagement which would normally come from meaningful player interaction when done correctly. Counter-Strike or any other highly competitive game generally doesn't have a need for highly random elements. But small random elements can have interesting results. A very similar game to Counter-Strike is the recently released Valorant. One difference that Valorant carries is that the spray pattern when shooting automatic weapons is randomized. In Counter-Strike, the spray pattern is set and learnable. In Valorant, it is randomized, and some people have argued that this lowered the skill cap of the game. Interestingly though, this shifted the skill from learning the spray patterns of the guns to learning proper fire control, burst fire timings, and so on. In a video by the channel Clickheads, linked below in the description, they go into detail on how Scream, a professional Counter-Strike player that has recently struggled a little bit, is now performing exceptionally well in Valorant, because his personal skill set and incredible accuracy matches what Valorant is asking for, and this all came out of increasing the randomness in only one simple design element of the game. As I said before, randomness seems to be there to provide the engagement we usually get from player interactions, and yet there are games which are engaging in PvE without much randomness at all. This is usually by framing the problems in a way that is either puzzle-like or difficult to perform and therefore requiring practice. When mastered, the engagement level of these games goes down. We see this often in rhythm games or MMOs where dungeons or raids are difficult and engaging upon first release. They present both performance and puzzle challenges, but they have very little randomness, and essentially no positive randomness at all, and therefore many players will play until they get through all of the content in the current patch and drop the game for a while. The game Into the Breach is built upon having very little randomness, and you are given essentially perfect information. The enemies forecast what they are going to do exactly, and the players theoretically given all the tools necessary to counter the enemy actions. The enemy actions are generated based on the game's AI, and therefore can be predicted when you have the game knowledge. And because you can see exactly what is going to happen next turn, you could argue that this game is entirely free of RNG. But the engagement once again comes from the puzzle-like nature of the combat. Figuring out how to counter enemy actions perfectly and winning is the moment-to-moment engagement offered here. Going a bit further though, this game does actually contain randomness, specifically in map generation and upgrades that are given to the player. These upgrades shape the options you have in combat, and the map layouts change the flow of the combat as well. Without these elements, the entire game could be learned and a perfect script written on how to win without ever taking any damage. And so even a game that is held up by having no randomness still relies on RNG elements to be engaging. One way developers attempted to marry PvE progression and randomness is by having roguelike elements. Blizzard's attempt in Shadowlands will be Torghast, the Tower of the Damned, but in general these systems lean heavily into being very random, and since we've covered that side of things already, I won't go too much into it here. Instead, I want to look at how RNG can be a bad thing. What can happen when things are too random? Gear progression in many games is random. The layers of RNG present can vary from as simple as whether or not the item dropped to item upgrades. secondary stats, or effects, etc. If a game is built around this, it can be intriguing and engaging. But I want to say that in general, the more randomness is added to gear progression, the more frustrating it gets. For example, the Titan forging and by extension the corruption system in World of Warcraft is hot garbage. Players can no longer be excited about what they are going to loot from their weekly chests or the bosses they defeat because the chances of you getting the item that you actually need is so slim. Randomness has gone too far here. In other games like Hearthstone, randomness can present itself in a way that feels like decisions are removed from the player. Building a deck to contain a combo does not guarantee that you can pull that combo off due to the order you draw the cards. Of course, the actual order you draw the cards being random is something shared by most card games, both virtually and in real life. But this does remove one layer of choice from the players. Or if we go back to the example of corruptions in World of Warcraft, the player's performance can be hugely decided by the random effect of these items, completely out of the player's control. With that, players are less incentivized to learn how to use their abilities properly and instead say, RNG, take the wheel! Another big example and cause of frustration in the modern gaming world would be the card packs or loot boxes offered in many games. The contents of these are randomly determined. They are basically just scratch cards, and in my opinion a blight on modern gaming. When you buy loot boxes, there is an excitement build-up which culminates in either a climax of joy or disappointment. In either case, the player is pushed to open another one, either to chase the next thing you want, or because surely this time, you'll get what you want. It is psychological manipulation without remorse under the guise of using randomness to increase engagement. On a final note, randomness has been part of gaming since the beginning, likely originating from board and dice games or gambling. It is a necessary component for player engagement, where the interaction between players isn't enough, and we need to better design systems that make the random elements focused on making gameplay smoother and more fun, rather than exploiting players. And if randomness is to be used for rewards, then the gameplay loop offered to the player needs to be designed with that in mind. Please leave any comments about your experiences with RNG below. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.